Welcome. This is a great crowd. We appreciate everybody coming out. I'm John Ackerman. I'm the president of Baywatch, and we want to thank y'all for coming out tonight. We got a great presentation by Julie McConnell, which is from the U of F Extension Service. But before we get started, I want to tell everybody about our March 3rd event. This Saturday, we have a golf tournament out at Sheridan Bay Point. And the purpose of the golf tournament is to save the bay, and it's also to raise funds for Baywatch. And so what we're looking for are golfers and some help perhaps on Saturday. So if you are one of the above, please come and talk to myself or to our sponsor there, Linda Fitzhugh. She's running the show for that. But the golf tournament is really essential for us because that is one of the ways we get money for supplies for all of our water testing and also our shoreline restoration projects, seagrass monitoring, things that we do on a regular basis. So any help that you can provide, we'd really appreciate it. So now I'm going to turn it over to Julie, and she's going to teach you everything you need to know about growing plants at home.
All right. Thank you. My name is Julie McConnell, and I work for the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. I'm an extension agent, so I'm extension faculty with the University of Florida. I also work for Bay County. It's a joint position between both entities. They have a memo of understanding, and they provide, they both contribute to salary, overhead, training, those types of things. And what our role is in the county is to provide science outreach. So we have all these great researchers, and we have our teaching faculty that teaches students for credit on campus, and we have our researchers actually scattered throughout the state. And we're here to kind of take that research information, turn it into something practical and useful for the taxpayers, which would be you. And so we do things through classes, we'll do workshops, sometimes we do field days, just a lot of different events, a lot of youth programs in the schools too. So here in Bay County, we have 4 faculty positions. All 67 counties in the state of Florida have an extension office, which is, part of the University of Florida, and just depending on what the community needs are, that is what dictates what type of program areas they have. So here in Bay County, we have Family and Consumer Sciences, which is run by my boss, Dr. Marjorie Moore, and she specializes in food safety, nutrition, food preservation, some of the stuff that we used to call home ec. Anybody remember home ec? Yeah, right? So, and some of those are kind of a lost art, which is really sad. It's funny, they were doing some food prep with some kids at one of the 4-H programs, and the children were taking apart a chicken, and I walked in, and I can't do it. So, I don't know if any of you feel that way about some of those things, but she teaches all those kind of home sciences, but her background is really with the food safety and nutrition. 4-H is the youth program. Was anyone in 4-H as a child? Yeah, we got a couple. Anyone have kids or grandchildren in 4-H now? Yay, okay. So it used to be a lot of agricultural activities with 4-H, and it is still in some counties, but because we don't really have a lot of that in Bay County, they do some really creative things, such as junk drawer robotics and public speaking. And one of our newest events that we've had, and she'll have a camp this summer, I don't have the dates handy, but if you're interested, contact our office, is tailgating camp. And it's not teaching kids to drink beer and root for the football team, okay? It is a really, really neat program that teaches them how to grill on charcoal. And they start off with the food safety. So they learn about, washing their hands and preparing the food and cross-contamination. My daughter came home telling me about listeria symptoms and all kinds of really gross stuff. They learn all of that. They pick their recipes. They do rubs and marinades. They prep the food. They light the charcoal. They man the grill. They cook it, and then they compete for flavor, texture, all that stuff. And the first year that we had the camp, 2 of our kids made it to state. One of them won 2nd in the state. So that's a really neat program. I'm horticulture, so my background is plants. I have a bachelor's in ornamental horticulture from Auburn University. I have a master's degree in entomology from the University of Florida. And I do a lot of training for industry people, so I do pesticide training. I give the exams for state certification. I do the continuing education with your landscapers. There's also a fertilizer license requirement. A lot of people maybe do not know that, but if somebody is applying fertilizer for hire, they are required to have a certification with the state. It's kind of a new thing. So If you know anybody in landscaping or you have somebody doing landscaping for you, those are some things you need to make sure that they have. Another thing is we do homeowner education, and really the biggest outreach there is through my Master Gardener volunteers. There's several of them here. And I've got about 60 active volunteers that do teaching. They answer questions from homeowners. They help with the 4-H program and other extension programs. And we could never reach the amount of people that we reach without those volunteers. So if that's something you're interested in, you could also contact our office. We also have Sea Grant, which is marine science. Scott Jackson, he works a lot with artificial reef and fisheries, and again, some of these shoreline restoration projects. And he is somebody that if you have coastal issues, he can assist with that. You have pond management issues, he can help there. We also have a sea turtle lighting specialist who's hired on a grant, who's working with converting the lights within, I think it's 1,000 feet or 1,000 yards. It's a certain distance from conservation land from the state parks. So they're retrofitting lights through a grant program within those parameters. And then we have a Florida 4-H military partnership coordinator that works with 4-H military families. Okay, now we're going to talk about plants. Sorry, I have to do the whole intro thing. So, and I appreciate y'all signing in. Because we do get public funds, we are required to get rosters and get some basic information, so I appreciate you doing that. So, has anybody heard of the Florida Friendly Landscaping Principles? A couple of you have, okay. So, there's a program called Florida Yards and Neighbors, and there's Florida Friendly Landscaping Principles, and basically there's 9 principles, and I'm not going to name all of them, because honestly I can't without a list. But the first one, and really what I think is the most important one, is right plant, right place. There are so many landscapes that I see fail because this was not taken into account, this wasn't done correctly. And a lot of times what we try to do is we get this vision in our head of what we want the landscape to look like. Maybe we see it in a magazine, maybe we see it on TV, and we don't take into account that maybe we don't live, or maybe our house or our yard is not the appropriate place for what we want it to look like, okay? Has anybody done that? They knew it was a shade plant, but they put it in the sun because that's the only place they had to put it. Anyone? Did that work for you? Not for long, right? Okay, we all do that. So that's really the biggest thing to take into account. And with herbs, most of them are sun lovers. Most of them like 5 to 6 hours of direct sunlight a day. There are some that will take some shade, though. And here in Florida, because the sun is so harsh and so hot here, we can kind of get away with a little more shade with them than maybe you could in Georgia, Alabama, some places that are a little bit further north. There are some that will take the shade, but they're still going to want some bright highlight. So you don't want it to be completely dark, dark shade. They're still going to need a little bit, maybe some morning sun, or that area where maybe you have some trees, but they're limbed up fairly high, so you've got some bright sunlight coming in. One thing that's very, very important with herbs is well-drained soil and allowing them to dry out between watering. Probably what I see people kill, or the way I see people kill plants most often, not just herbs, is too much water, okay? Too frequent watering and not allowing the soil to dry out. Your roots need oxygen, and if we constantly keep that soil saturated, you don't have the oxygen that the roots need, and we also can get rot issues. Okay, so that is a big one. Another thing is most of your herbs don't need to be watered after they're established. Now this is when they're in the ground. If they're in containers, you have to give a little bit more care because you only have so much soil volume and it's going to get completely dried out. So you don't want to do that. But for the most part, if you're planting them in the ground, and we can plant lots and lots of herbs in the ground here and they will live long term, once they're rooted out, you can kind of ignore them for the most part, okay? Another thing is not crowding them. You can do that temporary, especially if you're going to harvest a lot and you're going to clip them. You can kind of crowd them together, but if they're crowded and we have a whole lot of humidity, which we tend to have here, you can get some issues with them where the leaves touch each other on the different plants. Sometimes you get some leaf spots or some rot in between them. So you want to give them good air circulation. Most of the herbs that we want to grow here are from the Mediterranean region, which, it's warm there, it's sunny there, but it's not as humid and stagnant air as what we have here, okay? Another thing that they really perform well in, which is wonderful for us, is low organic matter soils. I don't know about y'all, but I live in Bayou George and I have sand. There is almost no organic matter in my soil at all. And anytime I try to amend the soil and add it, it breaks down really, really quickly and it's gone. So it's a struggle constantly. So herbs are good for those tough sites. Another thing with plants, any of them at all, is they're going to have different life cycles or life expectancies. So some of these are what we call annual, so they live for one season. Generally, you would say cool season or warm season. Of course, our seasons here are not so cut and dried. So sometimes we have plants that are supposed to be an annual, and you're supposed to lose it when we get a first frost or when it gets good and hot, and it stays for longer. So when I list these, like the basil, the dill, the coriander, cilantro, some of our common sages are supposed to be annuals. You might have a nice little microclimate in your yard where yours lives for years and years and years. Okay, same thing with our vegetable plants, your peppers and your tomatoes. They're not supposed to live for 2 and 3 years. They're supposed to go for a couple of months and then they're done. But sometimes we're lucky. So those are just bonus plants, and plants don't read the rule book. But there are some that we kind of consider those annuals. So basil is one that I'll talk about just a little bit more, is if you get a hard frost, it should take the plant out. It might not, but it's not supposed to live through that. And that's okay, it's supposed to be a short-term plant. Your biennials are going to live for 2 years. So typically what they do is you get a lot of foliage that first year, and they don't flower. Then the second year they flower, set seed, and then they die. So parsley is a really good example of an herb that does that. It may linger on longer, but usually it just doesn't look that good. So you may as well just consider it kind of disposable after 2 years. And then your perennials that live for 2 years or more, those are really great because those are some that you can incorporate into the landscape as part of your just permanent landscape, because you know if you take care of them, you're going to have them for, it could be 5 years, 10 years, who knows. So they can really be a permanent part of the landscape. And the rosemary, thyme, oregano, and mint, those are some really easy to grow ones, okay? So just for the basics, one thing I see a lot of people do is plant plants too deep, okay? You can do that with tomatoes. Anybody ever heard peel off the bottom 2 leaves and bury it up to that high and it'll root out? Yeah, tomatoes do that. There's probably some other annual flowers that will. Some of your salvias may do that also because they root out along the stem really easily. But in general, just as a good rule of thumb, if you don't know for sure that you can plant that plant deep, don't. Plant it high, okay? So when you take that plant out of the pot and you see the top of the root ball where that soil is, you want to make sure that after you have it planted, you've watered it, it's settled a little bit, because anybody ever notice what most of your potting soil is made out of? Not so much the annual flowers, but say your shrubs and trees. It's pine bark, right? It's shredded or chipped up pine bark. And they do that on the nursery because they have to make sure that it's going to drain well because they don't want to get root rot issues. So when plants are in a nursery setting, you're given a lot of water more frequently than you would do in the landscape because that's how they need to support the plants. So when you plant it, what happens to your mulch or your pine straw, your pine mulch after a little bit of time in Florida? Does it stay there forever? It decomposes, right? So when you plant these plants that have a lot of that, like a pine mulch or bark type of material in it, and if you plant it exactly level with the ground, and that starts to break down, your plant sinks, right? And then it's too deep. And then you're putting mulch on top, and the next thing you know, you've got a plant that's too deep, and you're not getting enough oxygen to your roots, and we see failure. We see this in woody plants all the time, okay? So always plant it so that it's roughly 10% above grade after you've watered it and it's settled for any of your plants. So I'm kind of going off on trees and shrubs here too, okay? With your herbs, do them a little bit higher. Doing it even, if it's a short-term plant, probably is not going to be a big deal, but if it's a perennial that you want to live for an extended period of time, always make sure it's a little above grade, okay? So not too deep. Also, with your herbs, water them until they're established and let them go. Even when you're watering to establishment, an establishment is just where the roots have had a chance to, go ahead and grow out into the media that you put it in, whether it's in a pot or it's in the ground. Then we want to back off on the water. And even when we're watering to establishment, you want to make sure you let the soil dry out between waterings. If you keep them saturated, they will rot, okay? That is what most people end up doing to, especially house plants and container plants, is watering too much, okay? I see people like pointing fingers at spouses. So only fertilize is needed. Most of your herbs have really low fertility needs, so you don't have to, put it on a regular plan. Just kind of watch it and see. If it's something that you're pinching a lot, like basil or your parsley, and it's starting to look a little washed out, and you can tell when plants are starting to look hungry, they kind of just get a little bit of an off color, and if you've determined it's not a water issue, then a little bit of fertilizer. But you can grow a lot of these, your oregano, your rosemary, your thyme, and you may not fertilize them the first year you have them, and even after that, it might just, it's really occasional. It's not something that has to be done multiple times a year. When we put a lot of fertilizer on plants that don't need it, yes, it does encourage growth, but a lot of times it's kind of too fast, weak growth. So it's better to just do it as needed. If it starts to look a little bit hungry, you could do something simple like a slow release 10-10-10, and don't feel like you've got to constantly put the fertilizer on it. And I have to show you this picture because this was at my office where I was growing some herbs, and you can kill them, okay? They're easy to grow, and they don't need a lot of water, but you have to do something to them. So I travel a lot with my job, and if I don't specifically ask somebody to water the containers on the porch, sometimes this is what happens. So you can kill herbs from not enough water. Okay. You also can end up with insects. I had mealybugs last year in herbs, which I had never heard of, but because I had drought stressed them so many times, that's what happens. Okay. So pH range of 5.5 to 6.5 is ideal. Anybody know what the pH of their soil is? Nobody's done a soil test? You don't really have to do one unless you're having some issues and it's kind of a good diagnostic tool as you're trying to figure things out. Usually if somebody's going to install a new landscape, I do recommend that they at least do a pH test just to find out what their pH is, especially if they're going to do a lot of turf grass or specialty plants that require a certain pH, such as maybe they want to do azaleas or blueberries, or some other acid-loving plant. You need to know what your pH is because it should really kind of guide some of your plant selection. Here in Bay County, we are all over the board. Because all the pH, or all the soil tests that go to the University of Florida, they send a copy to my office. And I can look those up and I can find people where they have pHs that are around 4, which is really, really acidic, all the way up to 8.5, which is very alkaline, okay? So most of them kind of tend to fall around 6.5, which is a good range for most plants, but you really cannot tell just by looking at the soil. And one of the things we also see is different pHs just within one property. When I bought my house, I have an acre lot, and I did about 6 different soil tests just because I kind of had different things in mind for what I wanted to do. And then I was also seeing different plants thrive in different ways. And on my lot alone, I did range from the low 5s up into around 6.8. So you really can't tell. Another thing is to make sure that you allow space for the mature size of the plant. Rosemary is a really good example of an herb that you can buy it at the store for about $3 or $4, and it's this big. They get about as big as me. So they get big. They can get 4 to 5 feet tall. They can get 5 feet wide. I'm taller than 4 to 5 feet tall, but maybe not quite as big as me. But they get really, really big. And so what a lot of times people will do is they don't realize how big the plant gets, so they put it somewhere where if it gets to the maximum size, it's crowding out other plants, or it's blocking a window, or there's something along those lines where it really shouldn't have been put there in the first place. So know what the mature size is and assume that you're not going to kill it and it's going to make it to the mature size. Another thing is that harvesting encourages foliage growth. So if you're going to use your herbs for cooking, pinching or clipping them is a good thing because it's going to make them grow. But you might want to think about kind of what shape you're going to inspire it to take, because what happens with plants is when we go in and we prune the tip off, it encourages growth within 6 inches below where you cut that off, okay? Unless you go to a branch angle. So if you have ever had some shrubs in front of your house and you got out there with that electric hedge trimmer and you just did this number across the top, and then it felt like 2 weeks later it was twice as big, and then eventually it gets thin at the base, right? Anybody seen that? That's because you're training the plant to grow the wrong way. There's hormones in that last bud on the very tip of the branch that's telling the buds below it not to grow. If you take that bud off, then it took away that inhibition, and so all those buds break and branch out. So how you cut those branches really has an influence on what the rest of your plant is going to look like. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. So if you want to control it for size, or if you don't want it to just get really fluffy, kind of crazy hair on top, then you need to go back and find an angle where it comes in from the stem of the plant and cut there. If you do that, it's not going to encourage growth behind it. Okay? So when you're harvesting, kind of think about that if it's something you're going to keep in your landscape. If you want to have a rosemary, I mean, you can go in and hedge clip it every once in a while, and it's not really going to matter. But if if you want it to have a certain shape, that's one way that you can control that. Another thing is avoiding pesticides. And really, usually you don't see pest pressure on your herbs. Sometimes you may get some fungal issues if you don't have good air circulation or you've crowded them. But usually there's not going to be fungal issues. But the real problem is that there are not too many things that are labeled for use on herbs because you're going to eat the foliage, okay? And you usually aren't going to cook it. So anytime you have a pest problem, you first off need to make sure you get it identified correctly, and our office can help with that. But the other thing is that if you have determined, you have a positive ID on a pest, whether it's an insect, a disease, or whatever the case may be, if you choose to use a pesticide, it must be labeled for the site you're applying it to. And that's not just my home, my business, not that kind of site. Sites are considered the plant material that it goes on, okay? So there are things that are labeled to use on vegetables. There are things that are labeled to use on lawns. There are things you can use on ornamental plants. You need to make sure that any product you use is labeled for the type of plant that you're going to put it on, okay? And it's on the label. It's required to be on the label. So I was going to talk about 5 easy herbs, and then I was like, I got to do 6, okay? So I'm going to run through these pretty quick because we're at 6:30 here. So basil, this is a warm season annual. Really, really easy to grow from seed. You can go down to any garden center. They're probably out right now, and you'll see there's different foliage color, there's different textures, they get different sizes, and whatever they smell like when you crush the leaf, that's kind of the flavor it's going to have. So there are lots and lots of different ones. But you can also grow them from seed. It doesn't take very long. And what I usually do is when I have them in my garden, if you let them flower and go to seed, they're going to slow down production of leaves. So then the plant's kind of done. So sometimes I'll kind of pinch the flowers off. And you know what I mean by pinch? I'm just saying, just cut it off. I mean, you can use your thumbnail most of the time, or you can cut it off with scissors. So that's what I mean by that. But if you want to try to keep it bushing out and not finish up and go to seed, then you can pinch the flower head off. But if you want to, because we have such a long growing season, you can let it flower. Pollinators love it. They'll come visit it. It'll set seed, and you'll end up with a bunch of little plants in your pod or on the ground within probably weeks. I mean, it doesn't take any time at all. So just recognize that that's what's coming up. So what I'll usually do is I'll go ahead and just let it go, and then I'll strip the flowers off and just kind of, or the seeds off, and just kind of do this number and let them fall all over the place. Tell my husband those aren't weeds and hope he believes me. So, but they'll just, they'll come up. And I always end up with basil in the same place in the garden from the year before. So I just try to warn him off and tell him, don't cover those up. Those are good. You can use them fresh or dried, but again, they're really, really easy to grow from seed. And these are just a couple other ones. They have pretty interesting names. One of the things, University of Florida does a lot of research on plants, and one of the things that they're developing is trying to develop some basils that get a little bit older before they flower, and that way they can get more foliage out of them and have a more compact growth and a little bit more yield. And I don't know what they're going to release, but that's something that they're really working on, because a lot of especially the restaurants that want to have the fresh herbs, and the suppliers for those restaurants, they want to have plants that are going to have a longer life, so to speak, and be useful. So mint was the one I kind of slid in as number 6. A lot of people don't like mint because it can grow very aggressively. So, but you can use that to your advantage, because what if you have a shady area that kind of stays damp and you need some ground cover to keep the soil from washing away? You can put mint, right? That's what that's where I use it, is under some hydrangeas in an area that was just too dark for the turf grass to grow. It was just kind of a dank area, and it really turned out pretty. And you can go in there and you can hit it with the weed whacker if it gets too bushy or starts growing up, and it smells wonderful when you do that. But if it is something that it's going to creep and crawl, and wherever it touches the ground, if it's got enough moisture, it will root out, okay? So just keep that in mind. If you want to grow mint, if you don't want it to run wherever it wants to go, then you can put it in a container. And the thing is, just watch it, because once it drapes down the side of the container, starts to crawl on the ground, yes, it will root out. But they don't really get woody. So if you decide you don't want them there anymore, they're pretty easy to get rid of. You can pull them up, or cover them up with some mulch, and or use an herbicide on them if that's what you want to do. But they're very easy to get rid of if you decide you don't want them anymore. But there are lots of there's chocolate mint and peppermint and spearmint, and there's so many different types that you can grow. And then if you do like it and you have somebody that would like to have some, it's very easy to share, because all you have to do is get a little piece of one with some root material on it, put it in some soil, keep it damp, and it'll just take off, okay? And it is a perennial also, so it's going to live for many years. And it stays evergreen for me. Even with this winter that we had, I didn't have any foliage die back. I think I got a little bit of bronzing, but other than that, it did really well. Oregano is another perennial. Now this one is going to like it a lot drier than your mint does, and again, full sun. It stays really low. There are some that are a little bit kind of globe-shaped, but they hug the ground, they're evergreen, they don't need a lot of care. You definitely don't want to crowd them. They have kind of the hairy leaves, and what I've found with the herbs is the ones with the fuzzy leaves tend to be more sensitive to overwatering, whereas the ones with the glossy, shiny leaves tend to take a little bit more water. So just kind of anecdotal there, something I've observed. But the oreganos, again, there's lots of different types of flavors, so you can usually find 2 or 3 at local garden centers. But usually you do this one by division. I have not tried to grow this one from seed. It may be available, but usually I just get transplants or just split a plant and share it. Okay. Parsley is a really easy one too. Now it's a biennial, so that's the one that's going to have a lot of foliage the first year. It'll be really thick and fluffy, and you'll just think it's wonderful. The next year it'll flower and seed, and then it'll start to die, and you'll think, what have I done, because it was beautiful last year. It's just the life cycle of the plant. It's only supposed to live for 2 years, and then it's supposed to die. Again, you can have one that struggles and hangs on a little bit longer, but just plan that you need to replace it. Also, parsley is a larval host for some of our butterflies, some of our swallowtail butterflies. And so what that means is that the adult butterfly will lay her eggs on it, and a caterpillar will hatch out, and actually a bunch of caterpillars will end up hatching, because she'll lay a bunch of eggs, and they will eat your plants, okay? So if you see them, you have the option. You can remove them and save your parsley, or you can plant more parsley and have more butterflies. Your choice. That's pretty much what I said. All right, so rosemary, this is probably my favorite herb. It is evergreen, it's a perennial, it gets big, it takes horrible, horrible sites, full sun, very little water once established. It's salt tolerant, so if you live on the ocean or near the ocean and have salt spray, it can tolerate that. Lots of different uses in culinary. And I don't know if anyone has noticed out at Pier Park and the parking lot islands, and then I think they've got some over at, what is it, North Bay Haven, that school on 390 where they've put some plants. Rosemary. They don't always look fantastic, but they live in these really, really inhospitable places, okay? They also will take kind of a high pH soil, so if you are one of those people that have a 7.5 pH and you can't seem to grow anything, rosemary might be an option. And you can really kind of shape the bushes if you want something that looks a little bit more formal, or you can let it get kind of wild and hairy. It's totally up to you. But the biggest thing is don't overwater it and don't over-fertilize it. And if you give it a good spot where it can get big and it can have good air circulation, it will really, really perform well. And again, it's evergreen, and it's cold hardy up to, I mean, Atlanta area. So what we have here doesn't phase it, as long as you're not pushing, you know, growth with a bunch of fertilizer late in the season, okay? But there are some different ones. You know, for as far as culinary herbs, you're really kind of looking at just your standard upright rosemary. But there are some creeping rosemaries that, you know, they have some fragrance to them. I don't know if they really have enough flavor to use in cooking, but there are some that creep along the ground that are very low and stay small, okay? Thyme is another one that is a good kind of almost a ground cover type, that it stays really low and spreads out. And there's a lot of different types. There are some variegated, there's lemon thyme, I think there's just some spicy, there's just a lot of different flavors on the thymes. And they kind of take it, their site is kind of halfway between where you put mint or oregano. So they'll take full sun, but a little bit of shade seems to favor them a little bit. And they need to drain out really well, but they seem to like water a little bit more than your oregano and your rosemary, okay? All right, so you can pretty much grow herbs wherever you want. Now, one thing I have not, been very successful with is growing them indoors. That is challenging, okay? We tend to keep our homes a little cooler than they like, and even though they like the low humidity, it still just might be not quite enough. Sometimes you can get them going in the windowsill, but we have such a good climate for herbs outside. I'd really encourage people to put them outside, even on a screened-in patio. You know, they don't have to be outside, but I think that, you know, they really benefit from having the heat that we have here in Florida. You can mix them in with ornamentals. You can, you know, put them in the landscape itself, whatever you want to do. They do great in containers, but you do have to water them occasionally, or else you'll have something that looks like mine. The biggest thing is making sure that you match the needs of the plants when you put them together, okay? So we kind of went over this. Sunlight, air circulation, not much water. Your mint, parsley, and basil will take a little bit more water and a little bit less sun than some of the other ones, okay? So those are, if you have those shady spots, those are some good ones. Or on your, you know, on a porch that's covered. This is an interesting project that we have at our office, and I don't know if our office is in the old Cedar Grove City Hall on East 14th Street, right behind Cedar Grove Elementary School. We have some gardens out there. We have a really beautiful butterfly garden that's on the corner of East 14th and James, I guess it's James Avenue. And then on the back side of our building, we have this spiral herb garden. And 2 years ago, it was 3 years ago, I had a master gardener training class, and I had a young man who was homeschooled, and he came through and did the training program as a teenager. He couldn't even drive himself to come to training. So, I mean, he's in college now. But he had this idea to do the spiral herb garden, and he was really, really passionate about it. And we said, okay, Travis, you want to do this? Take the lead. And he came up with this design by, you know, looking through some, you know, different publications and stuff. And he led the volunteers on building this. And what it is it's a spiral, and it has some height to it. I'll show you in just a second. But it's set up so that your plants that have the lowest water need are on the top of the spiral, and your ones that need the highest are on the bottom, and then also orient it for sun orientation as far as north, south, east, and west. Position them this way. And so this is what it looks like. And the master gardeners built this. One of them donated the bricks, but they went out there and they built this spiral. On top is lemongrass, and they've actually taken that out. It kind of overwhelmed the top of the plant, so now there's a rosemary there. But there's sage and mint and basil and thyme, rosemary, a lot of different types of herbs on there. So, yes? The drawing? And that ended up taking, they used like not quite a pallet of topsoil. What was it, about 40 bags, Johnny? Something like that. And I don't know how many bricks exactly, but, and what they've done is through the center, there is a PVC pipe that comes up, and then there's a sprinkler head on top, which we had on a timer, and we pretty much just ran that until the herbs were established, and it's been turned off now for quite some time. And this spring, when they put a few more plants in there, we'll have to turn the irrigation on for a little bit longer, get those established, and then we'll shut it off again. So, but yeah, you should, if you're in the area, you should come by and see it. There's no gate, so anybody can come anytime and look at it. Don't pinch all my herbs. So some of the combinations that seem to work well together, as far as some that will take some shade and some moist soils, your basil, stevia, parsley, mint, some of your variegated thyme. And then I also listed a handful of ornamentals because sometimes it's nice to just kind of mix them up. You know, if you know, especially if you have your perennial herbs that are going to last for a long time, you know, you may want to just put them with something that's a little bit prettier or showy. So creeping jenny, impatiens, some of your gingers, irises, shade coleus, and hydrangea are good mixes for any of those plants. You know, just make sure you give them the space. And the basil, you know, with the basil and the parsley being kind of temporary plants, just kind of keep in mind that when you mix them with plants that are supposed to be permanent, is, you know, if it comes time to rip them out, just kind of keep in mind that, you know, you don't want to disturb the other plants too much, so maybe kind of section them off just a little bit. But otherwise, you can combine them. For sunny, dry sites, of course, rosemary is a trooper. Oregano, some of your just regular thymes, fennel, and chives. And then we've got some mixed in our butterfly garden. Actually, this picture is from the butterfly garden. I think that's fennel, with purple coneflower, but your zinnias, black-eyed Susan, Shasta daisy, a lot of those kind of wildflowers that the pollinators like to come and visit that take those hot, dry sites would mix well with herbs. Okay, so I promised Linda that I would talk about vegetable gardens, but as you can see, I can talk about herbs for much longer. So my biggest thing that I just want to say is that when you're putting in your vegetable garden, timing is very, very important. Now, I said earlier that we kind of have not such clear-cut weather, and we can kind of get away with a lot of things, so, and we can. But in general, there are cool season vegetables and warm season vegetables. So the cool season, this is the stuff that's kind of probably doing really great right now, and it's about to cycle down. That's a lot of your greens, your kales, your collards, broccoli. You know, those are your cool season ones that can tolerate a frost or two. I know we had some pretty cold temperatures that damaged some of them, but for the most part, they can handle the cold weather. But once it gets hot, they don't like it. A lot of them will throw up flower bolts, and then they end up tasting bad, and you just give up on them when it gets hot, okay? And then we transition into our warm season. So those are the ones that are typically going to be frost tender. So our tomatoes and squash and beans and those types of plants. For this time of year, you know, we've got some of these that are kind of on the borderline, like potatoes. Anybody growing potatoes here? I had no idea you could grow potatoes in Florida when I moved here, but that was one of the things I learned from my master gardeners. Valentine's Day is like the best time to plant potatoes, right? You could still probably get away with it. It's getting pretty hot. But you know, you get them in by Valentine's Day and Memorial Day, you got potatoes, okay? Radishes are really easy to grow from seed. You end up having a radish in just a couple of weeks. If you have kids that are just kind of a little bit interested in gardening, or you want to get them excited about gardening, especially when it's cool outside, get some radish seeds. They come up so quick, and that, you know, you don't lose their attention. Some English peas and carrots you could still get by with in February. March, this is when we're getting into all our warm season vegetables are available right now. We could still get a frost before Easter, y'all. Okay? I know some of you are like, we will. And I don't care what the groundhog's saying, even though it's 80 degrees. We could get a frost. You can go ahead and put these in. Just be prepared to give a little bit of frost protection if we get a really hard freeze, okay? So if you're doing containers, those are pretty easy to, you can crowd them together and just get something around them. If you've got them in the ground, the thing with trying to protect from the freeze is what you're trying to do is, something like a light sheet that's not laying on the plants, that's kind of above them, but you're trying to anchor it down so that you're trapping that heat coming up from the soil. Okay, that's kind of what your goal is if you need to do that. But these are all some that you can go ahead and get started on. Just be prepared if we get that pre-Easter freeze. And just the basic needs is very similar to your herbs. You need some sunlight. One thing I've noticed here in Florida is the tomatoes. You can give a little bit of shade to your tomatoes and they appreciate it because we get sun scalding. Sometimes you get where the tops of them get like yellow and hard, and that can be from too much sun exposure. So they definitely need a bright place, and they do need some direct sun, but if your garden is full blazing sun from sun up to sundown, it may be a little too much for some of those plants. Yes?
Even growing in containers, the bugs like I have not successfully eaten a tomato on the plants that I've put in.
Yeah, so one of the things with tomatoes, and here's the thing. If you go ahead and start your tomatoes now, you risk the freeze, but you're normally ahead of the bugs. We've been really warm, so maybe not so ahead of the bugs. Once you get your tomatoes form and they just start to show just a teensy bit of pink or red, get them off the plant. They will ripen inside and it won't affect the flavor. They're going to be just as good. Because if you have them outside and they start to ripen up, you get the stink bugs and the birds, and all these critters will come. And, they might just take a teensy little taste, but once they do, then the fruit starts to spoil, right? So you can bring them in and let them ripen in the house. Once they start to transition that color, they're going to turn. So just bring them in early. Yes, sir?
Question about tomatoes. I bought the big ones, it's like the big boys planted them in a container, and they were like in partial sun and sunlight. But they only grew.
They didn't get very big?
They never got big. I've had terrible tomatoes. I can't grow tomatoes at all. So, they never grew.
I have the most luck with cherry tomatoes and Roma tomatoes, those small ones. The large ones, trying to get the big beefsteak and stuff, I've just struggled with them. I've given up, to be honest with you. It could be a water issue. It could be that there's not enough sun. If they're not getting of size, yeah, I don't know. It could be water. And they turn, but they turn. They ripen?
Yeah, they were ripe, but they were like the little sour tomatoes.
You sure they weren't mislabeled?
No,
because that could be it too. That could be it too, especially if if you went in the store. So I have caught my child moving tags around at the store. Okay, so I'm just saying that happens. Sometimes they get mislabeled coming in on the nursery, because a lot of times what happens in production is they don't have they don't have the labels in the pots when they're growing them in the greenhouse. They don't put the labels in until they ship them out, and so they could get mislabeled very easily. So if they ripen that small, I'm leaning towards mislabeled, definitely. But tomatoes are challenging, and one of the things that's really difficult with them is what we've found is that really the ones that have a shorter production time, what we call determinate tomatoes, where they're just going to produce for a handful of weeks and then the plant kind of goes down, those tend to perform better for us than the indeterminate, the ones that, if they're advertising that it's going to just produce all season long, those tend to struggle. I don't really know why, but doing those cherry tomatoes and then just staggering when you plant them can help. But yeah, the bugs are really an issue. But if you bring them in before they ripen, just after they turn, that helps. So But basically, you know, the sunlight, you might do some shading for if you're getting scald on your tomatoes. The water, it's the same kind of thing I was talking about with the herbs, although vegetables do need more attention than herbs do. I mean, these are typically annual plants. They're short-lived. They're only going to live for, you know, weeks to months, and you're going to get your production out of them, and then they're done. But one of the things is that consistent watering. You still need to let them dry out in between watering. You don't want to keep your garden saturated. But if you let them dry out too much, especially when they're putting on fruit, then you're going to see some issues. You may see some cracking in fruit or just poor production on that. So that's something you have to kind of play around with. Yes, Ina?
Would you use crop rotation with container gardening?
You could if you, so crop rotation is really something that needs to be done for your in-ground gardens. Did everybody get one of those tables, the charts, it's like 3 or 4 pages stapled together? So that right there is, it's actually some information that came from our Florida Vegetable Gardening Guide, which is a longer publication. But this I kind of teased out for North Florida as far as the timing on when to plant plants. And it also gives you, I think it gives you the family. Is there some horrible word that you couldn't possibly pronounce? Ends in, okay. So when we're rotating vegetable crops, what we're trying to do is rotate for that spot in the garden. We don't want to put a plant that's in the same family back in the same spot year after, you know, season after season after season, year after year after year. Because what happens is there are certain pests, whether it's an insect or a nematode, which is a microscopic worm. Did anybody have fun with those? Yeah, we have no treatment for. Or even some of the diseases. A lot of times they're very host specific. And so if you're planting plants that are very closely related and you have a pest issue that it preys on that family, so to speak, then you're just kind of helping them build up populations, and it just kind of gets worse and worse and worse. Does that make sense? So, you know, some of them that are, you know, tomatoes and peppers are related, and there's something else in that. Is it potatoes that's the same family? But you wouldn't think that a potato was that closely related, but it is. So that chart kind of helps you kind of figure out that, you know, for your garden, it's a good idea to plan to shift things around and move them from season to season or year to year. Yes? Yes and no. So there are some marigolds that repel some types of plant parasitic nematodes, but they also attract other species. So there isn't one plant that's going to make every nematode stay away, unfortunately. I still plant marigolds in with vegetables a lot of times just because I like them, and you know, they do have a little bit of a repellent quality, but not enough to get rid of them completely. So, and unfortunately, we have, I think probably 5 different like major pest nematodes in our area that affect plants, and the marigolds don't repel all of them. So you can do it. It's not going to hurt. I think it's the French marigold. I have to look it up. I can't remember, so don't quote me on that. But even still, you know, it's not a be-all, end-all. It's, you know, you got to rotate crops. So, yes, sir.
I can't keep cilantro alive to save my life. It bolts immediately and it goes to seed. What's the trick there?
It kind of prefers cooler temperatures. But that one is a little bit tricky. I think what happens a lot of times is it's available in the spring and we put it out, and then it's hot, and then it flowers, and then it's done. So, you know, I don't know if you could grow it from seed, like start it later in the summer and see if it will shuffle through the fall.
I've been trying to grow it indoors for the entire winter, and it just...
Oh, yeah, it's not going to be happy inside.
No.
Yeah. Yeah, it's probably just not hot enough inside, because it's going to want some warmth. So, she's gonna, yeah.
I was just going to say, in a large container, raised container, like a big planter, should you replace the soil, or how much year to year?
Really, it just depends. It depends on if you've had disease issues or not, or if you have pest issues. You know, if you get something like mealybugs or scale, where, you know, they will overwinter or lay eggs in the soil, or you've had a lot of disease issues, then you would probably want to swap it out. Yeah, and what I do when I have like big deep containers is I cheat. I don't fill the whole thing up with soil. I will put something in the bottom, and one thing that I like to do is I'll take like a nursery pot. So say you have a nursery pot that a shrub came in, flip it upside down and put it in the bottom of the container, and then just put the soil on top, and it fills in kind of in between. The water drains through just fine. Then you repurpose something that otherwise was just, you know, a plastic item. You know, as long as if you're planting things, you know, if your pot's this deep and you're planting stuff that only needs this much for roots, why fill it all the way up with soil? That's expensive. So I usually will just, you know, or milk jugs or, you know, different things like that that the water can flow around. So you can use rocks. Yeah, you could use rocks or bricks. And, you know, and one of the things is that you want to just make sure that you're not going to block your drainage holes, that the water can still flow down, and then the weight's going to become an issue. So there might be something where you want the weight in the bottom. If you know you're not going to be moving it around, if you don't need the weight, you could do the lighter things. So completely, yeah, that's a good use for it. Other questions?
You can also use your old terracotta pots.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah. Yep. I mean, the only thing you want to, you know, just want to make sure that it's, you know, that it's not something that, well, I mean, really you just don't want anything that's going to trap moisture and keep it really wet. So you want to make sure it's going to drain and dry out is your big thing. Definitely. I think the vegetable needs you do have to fertilize regularly with your vegetables. So, you know, whatever type of product you use, we usually recommend that you use slow release of whatever it is because, you know, with your quick release, we get a lot of rain and they go ahead and activate and run through. Scout for pests. So basically, if you're going to have a vegetable garden, it's a good idea to plan to take a look at it every day. Okay, that's really the biggest thing is don't ignore it. You know, you're going to have to, it may not need water every day, but if you can make it a habit to just go out and look for when issues start, you start to get a little leaf spot, a lot of times you can just pluck off the affected leaf, throw it away, and you've stopped it from spreading, you know, catch the insects early. Really, one of my favorite ways to control pests in a vegetable garden is what we call pick and squish. So, you know, you basically pick it off and you squish it. If you don't have the stomach for that, a bucket of soapy water, toss them in. So that, a lot of times, if you catch them early, you can keep it from taking over the garden, okay? What I have issues with at my house more than the bugs is deer. So we don't get to grow stuff at my house because the deer, and you know what's really funny, I know we're running out of time here, is we had no fence around our yard. We put up a fence. We did a 6-foot fence along the back because we have conservation land behind us and just did 4 foot on the sides. We have more deer in our yard now than we ever did before. They jump over the fence, and my husband's theory is it's safe in our yard because the predators can't get them. So I don't know if that's correct or not. These are a couple of upcoming events. This Thursday it's a commercial class for, I mentioned the fertilizer license. If you know anybody who needs that license, I do have a little bit of room in the class on Thursday. March 9th through 11th is the Great American Home and Garden Expo at the fairgrounds. It's free admission, so come in, see the vendors. The Master Gardeners are going to have their annual plant sale, and they'll be answering questions for homeowners. We have seminars. I only brought about 20 seminar sheets, so whoever got here first got those. You can find those, though. You can contact our office. We're going through a website transition right now, so it's kind of difficult, but on Facebook, we do have that published. On Facebook, there's a site for the expo and also an event. Another thing, there was some other flyers here in this building, well, we think in this room, we hope, if we hold enough people, is the Birds, Bugs, and Berries. And that's really a neat, it's a collaboration with Audubon and Native Plant Society and Bay Conservancy and who am I leaving out, Johnny? Of course, Master Gardeners and UF. Is there another? Okay. So there's all these groups that are coming together and offering this program. It's going to really be focusing on, you know, attracting birds. We already have 94 people registered for the class. So if you're interested, please register. It's free, but we're trying to see what our head count is so we have enough handouts for everybody. And if we come down to not having enough handouts, the people who registered will get them first. So sign up if you're interested. Any questions?
I got a quick question, just an observation. Someone may have tried this. I took 2 fruit trees, 2 orange, tangerine, and apricot, and I spliced them together. And it's been about, what, 5 years, 4 or 5 years now, maybe. And it's a pretty big stout tree now. The root, I mean, the stem on it, you know, it's a good sized base. It grows 2 types of fruit.
Right.
The apricot, which is really great, sweet, good fruit.
Yeah.
It grows up to the top of the tree. And then there's some little ones like little tangerines. Tangerines, they grow around the base. Now those things are really sweet. And they have a big air pocket in the middle, you know, the fruit, the inside fruit is surrounded by an air pocket on the outside shell. But this year, the lower ones, for some reason, the shell got pretty kind of hard. It's like a little nut actually. But you can actually crack the shell, you know, peel that little shell off. And the fruit inside, it's a small fruit inside, but it was just like sugar. And
Really?
It stayed longer than the ones on top. Just recently, I think I just took the last ones on the top of the tree off and gave them out. There was so many, so much fruit on it, I couldn't give them all away.
Yeah.
And it did well, so, you know, I'm kind of like, I just freaked yourself.
We call that experimenting.
They actually sell spliced trees like that now. They're called, like I've got one, it's called a cocktail tree, and it grows key limes and Meyer lemons on the same.
Yeah, because they'll graft them together, and as long as you've got enough compatibility that it will, kind of fuse, so to speak, you can do that. I mean, all of our citrus that we purchase is grafted onto a different rootstock. And so a lot of times we get calls, especially, I bet we'll get a bunch this summer because of the freeze that we had, where, the top part is what they call it and what you're buying. So say it's a Meyer lemon, and so that's the scion, I think is what the technical term is for it. So they graft that onto a rootstock of something that's got a better root system than what that lemon would have. Because the lemon might have wonderful fruit and all these other characteristics, but the roots are not that great. So they graft it onto a different rootstock. And what happens a lot of times is people have issues with their citrus and they don't realize that top part that was grafted on has died. And then the rootstock, a lot of times, will just go ahead and take over, and that part just grows up. So usually the call starts with, it looked really bad after we had that freeze, and then it grew really fast, got big, these thorns came out, and then it's got all these fruit, and they taste nasty. It's the rootstock. So the top part died, and the rootstock grew up. But because you can do that kind of thing, you could, like you did, you can put, desirable types and put them together, and then have a tree that's got multiple pieces on it. So, yeah, it's pretty neat. And if you're interested in propagation, there's going to be a propagation class at the Home and Garden Show on Saturday afternoon.